Carey Grayson was just 19 years old when his name became indelibly linked to one of Alabama's most horrifying and senseless crimes. A teenager from a small town, Grayson wasn't someone who stood out in his community, at least not until the night of March 21st, 1994. What began as a seemingly ordinary evening took a sinister turn that would leave a scar not just on the small community he called home, but on the nation as a whole. The brutality of his actions shocked the conscience of a country, sparking outrage, disbelief, and a cascade of questions that would linger for decades. Grayson was the kind of young man who could have easily flown under the radar, a background of ordinary struggles, a blend of youthful recklessness, and the often overlooked challenges of growing up in a small rural town. But beneath the surface lay a darkness that no one could have predicted. That fateful night, his path crossed with that of 37-year-old Vicki Lynn DeBlue, a trusting woman hitchhiking her way home to Louisiana. It was a meeting that would change the course of countless lives and leave an indelible stain on the community. When Grayson and his friends stopped to offer Vicki a ride, there were no outward signs of the horror about to unfold. Yet as they drove into the isolation of a deserted road, their intentions became terrifyingly clear. For Vicki, what might have seemed like a lifeline in a moment of need turned into a nightmare beyond comprehension. The violence inflicted upon her was not just cruel, it was calculated and remorseless, revealing a capacity for inhumanity that sent shockwaves far beyond the borders of Alabama. The crime was more than horrifying, it was incomprehensible in its savagery. Investigators, seasoned in handling the worst of humanity, were left struggling to reconcile the brutality of the act with the apparent youth and normalcy of the perpetrators. Details of the crime filtered out slowly at first, each revelation more shocking than the last. Vicki's murder became a lightning rod for debates about the fragility of trust, the depths of cruelty, and the very nature of justice. Grayson's trial would become one of the most emotionally charged legal battles in Alabama's history. The courtroom became a stage for a drama that captivated the nation, exposing not only the grim details of the crime but also the stark divisions in how justice is pursued and perceived. For the victim's grieving family, the trial was an opportunity to demand accountability, to make sure that Vicki's life was not defined solely by the circumstances of her death. For the defense, it was a fight to contextualize Grayson's actions within the framework of his youth and troubled upbringing. Yet even as the trial unfolded and a guilty verdict seemed inevitable, the story didn't end there. What followed were years of legal wrangling, appeals, and delays, each one reopening wounds for Vicki's family and reigniting public debates about the death penalty. The decades that passed between the crime and its resolution saw the case evolve into a symbol of a system grappling with its own contradictions. The balance between justice and mercy, between punishment and redemption. But just when it seemed like the long journey toward closure was nearing its end, an unexpected twist shocked the nation once again. A controversial decision by the Supreme Court threw the case into uncertainty, reigniting tensions and raising more questions than answers. The move brought the spotlight back onto Grayson and his crime, as well as the legal and moral implications of his sentence. How could a case so clear-cut find itself tangled in further controversy? What did this mean for Vicki's family, who had already endured so much? This is more than a story of one crime. It's a window into the darkest corners of human behavior, the complexities of justice, and the resilience of those left behind. Join us as we delve into the details of a crime that shattered a family, stunned a nation, and continues to shape the way we think about accountability and morality. From the chilling events of that fateful night to the legal battles that defined an era, this is a journey you won't forget. Stay with us as we uncover the truth, honor the victim, and explore the broader implications of a case that refuses to be forgotten. The day started like any other for 37-year-old Vicki Lynn DeBlue. She was a kind-hearted woman who had faced her share of struggles, but always found a way to push forward. She was on her way home to Louisiana, hitchhiking along the quiet back roads of Alabama. It was a common practice for her, something she had done countless times before, but this time was different. This time the car that pulled over wasn't filled with good Samaritans. Inside were Carey Grayson and his friends, a group of teenagers with trouble in their eyes and chaos in their hearts. They offered her a ride, their smiles hiding their sinister intentions. Vicky hesitated for a moment, but the late afternoon sun was beginning to set, and she was tired. Against her better judgment, she climbed into the car, her instincts muffled by their feigned friendliness. As they drove, the mood in the car shifted. What began as casual conversation grew darker, the boys' laughter taking on an edge that set Vicky on edge. She clutched her bag tighter, her gaze darting to the car doors as her sense of unease deepened. But it was already too late. The moment they turned down an isolated dirt road, her fate was sealed. What happened next is almost too horrifying to recount, a descent into cruelty so vile it would haunt everyone who learned the details. Vicky was subjected to a level of brutality that defied human comprehension. Grayson and his friends, driven by a sadistic blend of arrogance and apathy, unleashed a vicious attack that left even seasoned investigators questioning how such depravity could exist. They beat her mercilessly, their blows landing with a force fueled by a chilling disregard for life. Her desperate cries for mercy echoed through the desolate woods, swallowed by the silence of the night. They didn't stop there. The violence escalated in a manner that seemed almost performative, a sickening display of their detachment from humanity. As Vicky struggled, her body battered and broken, the group mocked her suffering, their cruel laughter ringing out in the darkness. It was a twisted symphony of violence and mockery, an unthinkable violation of her dignity and humanity. Each strike, each word, was a horrifying reminder of the abyss into which these young men had descended. When the torment finally ended and Vicky lay lifeless, they dragged her body to the edge of a towering cliff. Without hesitation, as if discarding a broken object, they hurled her over. The sound of her body hitting the jagged rocks below reverberated through the night, a haunting testament to their heartlessness. For them, it was a game, a grotesque thrill that seemed to bring them joy. But for Vicky's family, it marked the beginning of an unending nightmare, the kind that steals sleep and peace of mind. The next morning, as the sun cast its light over the quiet woods, a local hiker stumbled upon a scene that would change the course of the small community forever. The sight was gruesome, almost unreal, and the horror of what had happened began to ripple outward. Word spread quickly, and soon the community was gripped by shock and fear. How could something so heinous happen here? And who could be capable of such evil? Law enforcement mobilized immediately, launching a manhunt that would uncover not just the horrifying details of Vicky's murder, but the deeply disturbing nature of the people responsible. Grayson and his friends, however, didn't flee or hide. Instead, they brazenly bragged about their actions to friends and acquaintances, treating Vicky's death as a badge of honor. Their arrogance and complete lack of remorse stunned even those who knew them, and their boasts quickly led investigators to their doorstep. The arrests were swift and without incident, but the shockwaves continued to spread. The community, once a quiet and seemingly safe place, was now the epicenter of a tragedy so dark it defied understanding. People whispered in disbelief, trying to reconcile the image of familiar teenagers with the monstrous acts they had committed. How could a group of boys barely out of childhood be capable of such unthinkable cruelty? And perhaps even more chillingly, how could they laugh about it afterward? As investigators pieced together the events of that horrific night, the answers they uncovered painted a deeply unsettling picture. Grayson and his accomplices were not just cruel, they were utterly devoid of empathy. Their actions were driven by a toxic mix of entitlement, thrill-seeking, and an apparent pleasure in inflicting pain. They didn't see Vicky as a person, but as an object, something disposable and unworthy of even basic humanity. For Vicky's family, the details were almost too much to bear. The vibrant, kind-hearted woman they loved had suffered an unimaginable fate, her life stolen in a moment of unspeakable violence. Her mother, who had been eagerly awaiting her return, was left to grapple with the horrific reality of her daughter's final moments. The pain was indescribable, but it was compounded by the knowledge that those responsible seemed to feel no remorse, no regret. As the town struggled to come to terms with the tragedy, the stage was set for a reckoning. The questions that hung in the air, about justice, humanity, and the capacity for evil, would soon take center stage in a trial that would captivate the nation. But even as the legal wheels began to turn, the community was left to grapple with the deeper, more unsettling question. What had gone so wrong to produce such a horrifying act of cruelty? As the investigation continued, the town braced itself for what was to come. This was no ordinary case. This was a story of pure evil, a crime so heinous that it demanded not only answers but consequences. The stage was set for a trial that would captivate the nation and expose the dark truths lurking in the shadows of what seemed like an ordinary town. As the details of the case unfolded, the quiet Alabama town became the center of national attention. Reporters swarmed the area, their cameras capturing every grim detail as investigators methodically pieced together the events of that fateful night. The community, already shaken to its core, was now thrust into the harsh glare of the media spotlight. The name Carey Grayson was on everyone's lips, a chilling reminder that monsters could hide behind even the most unassuming faces. Grayson's arrest was anything but remorseful. When authorities questioned him, he showed no signs of regret or sorrow. Instead, he smirked, as if the gravity of his actions hadn't fully registered. Or worse, as if he didn't care. Witnesses to his behavior described him as cold, detached, and disturbingly proud of what he had done. It wasn't just the crime that shocked the community. It was his complete lack of humanity in its aftermath. The trial that followed would be one of the most emotional and contentious in Alabama's history. The courtroom was packed with onlookers, some curious, others there to support Vicky's grieving family. Her mother sat in the front row clutching a photograph of her daughter, her tears a silent testament to the pain that words could not convey. Each day she listened as prosecutors detailed the horrifying acts committed against her child, her heart breaking anew with every revelation. The prosecution's case was airtight. They presented physical evidence linking Grayson and his accomplices to the crime scene, as well as chilling testimony from those who had heard the boys bragging about the murder. The jury was shown photographs of the cliff where Vicky's body was found, her lifeless form a haunting reminder of the brutality she endured. Every piece of evidence painted Grayson as a cold-blooded killer, a man who had taken pleasure in the suffering of another human being. But the most gut-wrenching moments came when Vicky's family took the stand. Her mother spoke of her daughter's kindness, her love for life, and the senselessness of her death. She trusted people, she said through tears, her voice trembling. She believed in the goodness of others, and they took that trust and destroyed her. Her words brought many in the courtroom to tears, a stark contrast to Grayson's stony demeanor as he sat at the defense table. Grayson's attorneys tried to argue that his age and troubled upbringing should be taken into account. They painted a picture of a young man who had been failed by the system, whose actions were the product of a difficult life rather than an inherently evil nature. But the jury wasn't swayed. The evidence was too damning, the crime too heinous. After deliberating for just a few hours, they returned with a guilty verdict. The sentencing phase was equally intense. The prosecution argued that Grayson's lack of remorse and the sheer brutality of the crime warranted the harshest penalty available. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment, the prosecutor said, his voice firm. This was a calculated, sadistic act. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he showed no mercy. Vicky's family listened intently, their emotions raw but controlled. They wanted justice, not vengeance. For them, the death penalty wasn't about punishment. It was about ensuring that Grayson could never hurt anyone else. "We lost Vicky in the most horrific way imaginable," her mother said. "The least we can ask for is some measure of accountability." When the judge handed down the death sentence, the courtroom was silent, the weight of the decision hanging heavy in the air. For some, it was a moment of relief, a small measure of justice in an otherwise unjust world. For others, it was a sobering reminder of the severity of Grayson's actions and the ultimate cost of his choices. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was divided. Some cheered the verdict, seeing it as a victory for justice. Others questioned the morality of the death penalty, wondering if it was truly the right response to such a heinous crime. But for Vicky's family, the decision brought a sense of closure. It didn't erase their pain or bring back their loved one. But it was a step toward healing, a way to honor Vicky's memory by holding her killer accountable. As the media frenzy subsided, the town tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. But the scars left by Grayson's actions would not heal quickly. For Vicky's family, the road ahead was still filled with challenges. They would have to navigate their grief while grappling with the long, drawn-out appeals process that inevitably followed a death sentence. But in their hearts, they carried the hope that one day they would find peace, and that Vicky's story would serve as a reminder of the importance of compassion, justice, and the enduring strength of love. The sentencing of Carey Grayson marked the end of the trial, but it was far from the end of the story. While the courtroom fell silent, the legal battles surrounding his fate were only just beginning. As is common in death penalty cases, Grayson's defense team launched a series of appeals, challenging everything from the evidence used in his conviction to the fairness of his trial. For Vicky's family, each new hearing reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal, forcing them to relive the nightmare over and over again. Grayson's attorneys argued that his young age at the time of the crime should exempt him from the death penalty. They pointed to his troubled upbringing, claiming that he had been a victim of neglect and systemic failure, factors that they argued contributed to his actions. While these arguments stirred some public debate, they did little to sway the courts. The overwhelming evidence of his guilt and the heinous nature of his crime kept the death sentence firmly in place. Years turned into decades, with Grayson's case winding its way through the complex web of the American legal system. Each appeal brought a fresh wave of media attention, reigniting the pain for Vicky's family. Her mother, now older but still steadfast, attended every hearing, determined to see justice through to the end. "I promised Vicky I wouldn't stop fighting for her," she said in an interview, "and I won't." As the legal delays stretched on, the debate over capital punishment grew louder. Some questioned whether the death penalty was truly a deterrent, while others argued that it was the only appropriate punishment for crimes as heinous as Grayson's. For Vicky's family, the issue wasn't about politics or philosophy. It was about accountability. "This isn't about revenge," her mother often said. "It's about making sure he can never hurt anyone else." But even as the appeals dragged on, the weight of his sentence seemed to have little effect on Grayson himself. Reports from prison described him as defiant, unrepentant, and even dismissive of the gravity of his situation. His lack of remorse became a focal point for those advocating for the death penalty, a stark contrast to the pain and grief he had caused. In 2024, nearly 30 years after Vicky's murder, Grayson's execution was finally scheduled. The announcement brought a mix of emotions to the community. For Vicky's family, it was a bittersweet milestone, a step toward closure, but a painful reminder of all they had lost. For others, it was a moment of reckoning, a chance to reflect on the crime that had shocked their town and the justice that had followed. As the execution date approached, however, an unexpected twist sent shockwaves through the case. A last-minute reprieve was granted, thanks in part to a controversial decision by the U.S. Supreme Court. One of the justices, a Trump appointee, sided with arguments that procedural errors during Grayson's trial warranted further review. The decision temporarily halted the execution, sparking a nationwide debate. For Vicky's family, the reprieve was a crushing blow. They had waited nearly 3 decades for this moment, enduring years of legal delays and emotional turmoil. To have it taken away at the 11th hour felt like a betrayal, not just of their trust in the system, but of Vicky's memory. "It's like losing her all over again," her mother said tearfully. "We just want this to be over." The decision also divided the public. Some saw it as a necessary safeguard to ensure justice was fairly administered, while others viewed it as a bureaucratic delay that only prolonged the suffering of Vicky's family. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, with signs reading "Justice for Vicky" and "End the Delays," clashing against those calling for the abolition of the death penalty. For Grayson, the reprieve was a temporary victory, but it did little to change the inevitable. The courts ultimately reinstated his execution date, affirming the original verdict and sentence. As the clock ticked down to his final moments, the community braced itself for the conclusion of a saga that had left deep scars on everyone involved. For Vicky's family, it was a reminder of the resilience they had been forced to cultivate, a testament to their enduring love for a woman whose life was stolen too soon. The new execution date for Carey Grayson was set, and the town once again found itself on edge. The nearly 30-year journey toward justice had been grueling for Vicky Lynn DeBlew's family and community. As the final days approached, emotions ran high, with many grappling with the weight of the impending execution. For some, it was the long-overdue conclusion of a harrowing chapter. For others, it was a moment to reflect on the complexities of justice, punishment, and humanity. Vicky's family prepared for the day with a mix of anticipation and dread. Her mother, now in her late 70s, spoke to reporters outside her home in the days leading up to the execution. "I've been waiting for this moment for so long," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "Not because it will bring her back, but because it's the only way to close this door. We've carried this pain for decades. It's time for us to let it go." The prison, too, was buzzing with activity as preparations were made. Executions are meticulously planned events, with every detail scrutinized to avoid mistakes. The staff, many of whom had worked in the facility for years, approached the task with a sense of solemn duty. They were not there to judge. They were there to carry out the law. Still, the weight of the act hung over them like a shadow. Grayson's behavior in the days leading up to his execution was unsettling. In interviews with prison staff, he remained defiant, refusing to express any remorse for his actions. Some reports claimed he even mocked the gravity of the situation, making crude jokes and dismissive remarks about the process. His cold demeanor only deepened the public's disdain for him, reinforcing the belief that he was beyond redemption. On the day of the execution, the prison was surrounded by a sea of protesters. On one side were those demanding justice for Vicky, holding signs with her picture and chanting her name. On the other were death penalty abolitionists, arguing that Grayson's execution was an act of state-sanctioned cruelty that would do nothing to heal the wounds of the past. The tension between the two groups was palpable, a stark reminder of the divide that capital punishment often creates. Inside the prison, Vicky's family gathered in a private room to prepare for what they were about to witness. The decision to attend an execution is never easy, and each family member had wrestled with it in their own way. Her mother held tightly to a small photograph of Vicky, her fingers trembling as she whispered a prayer. "I need to see this through," she said softly. "For her, for all of us." As the time drew near, Grayson was led into the execution chamber. His demeanor was as cold and unrepentant as ever. Witnesses later described him as smirking as he looked out at the small crowd gathered behind the glass partition. Among them were Vicky's family, prison officials, and a few members of the media. Grayson was offered the opportunity to make a final statement, but his words were anything but remorseful. Instead, he used the moment to lash out at the system, blaming everyone but himself for his fate. The method of execution was nitrogen hypoxia, a relatively new and controversial approach. Designed to induce unconsciousness and death by replacing oxygen with nitrogen, it had been billed as a more humane alternative to lethal injection. But the lack of precedent and lingering questions about its effectiveness made the procedure the subject of intense scrutiny. As the process began, Grayson's bravado faded. Witnesses described his body tensing, his breaths growing shallow before his eyes fluttered shut. It was over in minutes, but the impact of those moments would linger far longer. For Vicky's family, it was the culmination of years of pain, waiting, and uncertainty. They held one another close, their tears a mix of grief and relief. Outside the prison, the reactions were just as mixed. Supporters of the death penalty hailed the execution as a victory for justice, a long overdue reckoning for a man who had caused unimaginable pain. Opponents, meanwhile, pointed to the lack of remorse and the gruesome nature of the crime as evidence of a broken system. "This isn't justice," one protester said. "This is vengeance, and vengeance doesn't heal wounds." As night fell, the prison grounds emptied, and the town was left to process what had happened. For some, the execution brought closure. For others, it raised questions about the moral and ethical implications of capital punishment. But for Vicky's family, it was a moment of quiet resolution. They had carried her memory for so long. their love for her sustaining them through the darkest times. And now, with Grayson gone, they could finally begin to focus on honoring her life rather than mourning her death. In the days that followed, Vicky's mother spoke to a local reporter about what the execution had meant to her. "It doesn't bring her back," she said. "It doesn't erase what he did, but it lets us move forward. It lets us remember her as she was. A kind, loving soul who deserves so much more than what she got." Her words resonated with the community, reminding them that the real story wasn't about Carey Grayson. It was about Vicky. It was about her life, her legacy, and the love that her family continued to carry in her absence. For them, justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about ensuring that her story was never forgotten. And in that sense, they had succeeded. In the months after Carey Dale Grayson's execution, the case didn't fade quietly into history. Instead, it reignited a national conversation about justice, accountability, and the death penalty. Grayson's lack of remorse, the horrifying details of his crime, and the decades-long delays in carrying out his sentence became a flashpoint in an already polarized political climate. But this was no ordinary debate, because by then the political landscape had shifted dramatically. Donald Trump, having returned to the presidency, wasted no time in addressing the nation's growing concerns over violent crime. At a high-profile rally, Trump's rhetoric was as fiery as ever, drawing cheers from thousands in attendance. "The days of endless appeals and soft-on-crime policies are over," he declared, gripping the podium with intensity. "When someone commits unspeakable acts, like Carey Grayson, they will face swift and certain justice. No more delays, no more loopholes. Justice will be served." Trump's return to power came with sweeping promises: harsher penalties for violent offenders, a streamlined appeals process for death penalty cases, and an aggressive stance against what he called America's crime epidemic. He repeatedly referenced Grayson's case, pointing to the decades of pain endured by Vicky Lynn DeBlue's family as proof of a broken system. "Families like Vicky's shouldn't have to wait 30 years to see justice done," he thundered. "Under my administration, that kind of disgrace will never happen again." The president's words sent ripples through the nation. Supporters praised his decisive tone and called his plan a long-overdue correction to what they saw as a permissive justice system. "It's about time we put victims first," one commentator said on a conservative news outlet. "Grayson's case is exactly why we need strong leadership on this issue." But not everyone was on board. Critics argued that Trump's policies risked undermining the careful deliberation required in capital cases, potentially leading to irreversible mistakes. "Rushing justice is not the same as achieving justice," said a prominent legal scholar. "Cases like Grayson's are rare, and while his crime was horrifying, the president's rhetoric risks creating a system where speed trumps fairness." For Vicky's family, the renewed focus on their case was bittersweet. They had spent decades waiting for justice, enduring delay after delay as they fought to honor Vicky's memory. While they appreciated Trump's commitment to preventing similar ordeals, they worried about the potential consequences of a system that prioritized speed over thoroughness. "We want justice for everyone," Vicky's mother said in an interview. "But justice has to be fair, and it has to be right. We can't sacrifice that in the name of expediency." The debates over Trump's policies quickly spilled into the public sphere, fueling heated conversations at dinner tables, workplaces, and town halls across the country. News networks played footage of Trump's rally alongside images of Grayson's trial and execution, while opinion pieces dissected the president's plans from every angle. In the meantime, the foundation established in Vicky's name experienced a surge in donations and support. Her family expanded their work, hosting events that brought together victims' families, legal experts, and community leaders to discuss the future of justice in America. One particularly emotional event was held in the very town where Vicky had lived and died. Survivors shared their stories, former offenders spoke about their paths to redemption, and Vicky's mother addressed the crowd with quiet determination. "We can't change what happened to my daughter," she said, holding a Bible in her trembling hands. "But we can change what happens next. We can make sure no family has to feel forgotten, no victim has to be ignored, and no community has to be torn apart like ours was. The audience responded with a standing ovation, many in tears. The night ended with a reading from Amos 5:24. "Let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream." The words echoed through the hall, a solemn reminder that justice is as much about perseverance as it is about punishment. As Trump's policies began to take shape, the changes were swift and dramatic. His administration pushed through legislation that prioritized expedited appeals for death penalty cases, arguing that drawn-out processes only re-traumatized victims' families. Some states followed suit, enacting stricter sentencing guidelines and harsher penalties for violent crimes. While these moves were celebrated by some, they also drew sharp criticism from those who feared the potential for errors and abuses. Trump's rallying cry, "Justice delayed is justice denied," became a mantra for his supporters. But it also sparked protests from activists who argued that the justice system needed reform, not acceleration. Outside courthouses and state capitals, demonstrators carried signs reading, "True justice takes time," and "Stop the cycle of violence." The divide between the two sides felt wider than ever, with Grayson's case at the heart of the storm. Despite the controversy, the changes brought by Trump's policies undeniably reshaped the landscape of American justice. For families like Vicky's, the focus on victims' rights and swift accountability felt like long overdue recognition of their pain. But for others, the fear of wrongful convictions and an overzealous system cast a shadow over the president's promises. In a televised address marking his first year back in office, Trump doubled down on his vision. "America will no longer be a place where criminals feel emboldened," he said, his voice firm. "We will protect our communities, honor our victims, and ensure that justice is more than just a word. It's a promise." The lasting impact of Trump's policies remains uncertain, but the legacy of Vicky Lynn DeBlue is clear. Her story, though born of tragedy, continues to inspire conversations about what justice truly means. Through the foundation established in her memory, her family has turned their grief into action, creating a space for healing, learning, and change. For those who hear this story, let it serve as a reminder of the importance of justice, not just as a punishment, but as a process of accountability, healing, and hope. Share your thoughts in the comments below and consider subscribing to join this community. Together, we can honor Vicky's legacy by working toward a world where justice is swift but fair, decisive but compassionate, and always rooted in the truth.